We have to wait for a few seconds. We'll wait on Omar. All good.
Counted. All good. Sorry.
All fine. Peace. Prime Minister, you have the floor whenever you're ready.
Wait, just give me like 20 seconds. I'm drinking some water and I'll start.
All good, dude.
Okay. All right. Confirming if I'm audible and visible perfectly.
Yes, perfectly. Whenever you're ready.
Okay, cool. I'll take PYs exclusively in the chat. Please don't unmute yourself. I find it interrupting. Cool. Starting my speech. Oh, also like I'll prefer closing up over opening up. I'll call for one about like four or five. Cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, we live in a world wherein media information is just ultimately becoming a lot more distorted in terms of the way it is presented to individuals, but also to a certain extent, the way it is received by individuals. Because of the fact that you probably have majority stakeholders existing in media corporations that probably to a certain extent have all the more leeway to kind of censor the kind of information that you're going ahead and posting, the way you probably come up with information, and the way you go ahead and portray them. I'm going to go ahead and do a couple of pieces of framing before I tell you like constructive case from our side of the house. Number one, in terms of what these corporations in status quo largely look like with like majority stakeholders existing who probably have 51% or more stake, but also, for example, it just looks like Fox News to a certain extent being run by like Fox organization, which is also running by a family, a group of conservative people that going ahead and like perpetuating this entire cycle of like bad news to begin with. But second, we think that media corporations play a unique role, especially in all the world, but specifically within the developing world. Why is it true? There are a couple of reasons for this. Number one, we think these are like prime sources for information dissemination of individuals. This obviously means that people go ahead and get information about their world largely from these like corporations to begin with. Second, we think these are first source of information for a lot of individuals, which means that the kind of opinions that individuals go ahead and make, and please specifically note the first-hand opinion that they go ahead and make plays a very crucial role because these are the kind of corporations that are most easily accessible to them, and that is why it becomes the first source of information to them. We think this becomes very crucial role because that is how you go ahead and cover your multiple views in general being better, but more importantly, the way you navigate your life is also to a certain extent dependent on it. Given the fact that on the basis of media, you have like a lot of conversations, you have a lot of discourses and things like that to begin with. Number one then, why this majority stakeholder necessarily goes ahead and discards the kind of discourse that we probably want to see within the world? Number one, we think to a certain extent, majority stake necessarily means that you also have direct influence over CEOs and board of directors. Opposition before coming up and saying that they'll probably operate independently is just foolish because of the fact that your stakeholders to a certain extent, you have larger say, and that is why your ability to go ahead and exert pressure over them and influence to a certain extent is incredibly high. This means a lot of times their voices are not pretty much taken into account, and that is why your majority stakeholder will pass on any policy you come up with to a certain extent, even without listening to what your opinions are, or even if they go ahead and listen to a certain extent is not valued because they still go ahead and have that majority stake. Second, we think it necessarily becomes easy for these individuals to dominate these corporations to come up with unilateral narratives, and that is why perpetuate propaganda and thus encompassing the multiple ideas becomes incredibly difficult. Because notice at a point in time you're existing as like stakeholder who is existing as a majority, like on a majority stakeholder of a media corporation, it's incredibly easy for you to go ahead and perpetuate your own unilateral narrative, not being able to go ahead and take into others' account. But third, becomes really worse, especially on incredibly big organization and in most, like, to a certain extent existing within status quo like Fox News, CNN, and specifically within India, like say Republic India and things like that. To a certain extent, they also go ahead and hegemonize the kind of coming up, like the kind of content that they come up with. And also to a certain extent, given the fact they have more and more strong AI existing with them, it necessarily forces you algorithms to feed the same content again and again. So if I'm going ahead and watching like right-wing content, it's most likely going to be the case this media corporations existing in a nexus will probably have incredibly strong AI, and to a certain extent, these algorithms to feed me that content again and again. This also looks like launching censorship of content, and thus any possibility that op might come up with like multiple ideas and things like that is even worse, because the screen time is not only asymmetric, the kind of information that you have, but the portrayal is even terrible. This looks like the farm protests in India being portrayed as the trucks and tractors were run over individuals, but not also going ahead and covering the brutality shown at the helm of the state. And at this point in time, we think it becomes particularly bad, because notice that these are the information that are going to be more crucial, and that is why they are to a certain extent going to have that sort of like censorship to begin with. Secondly, how it just like harms the kind of developing world largely. Number one, with the ability and possibility to have incredibly high and strong corporate nexus is incredibly likely to begin with. We think given the fact these majority stakeholders are also going to running on the perspective of profits, to a certain extent, they have all the more incentives to go ahead and strike deals with state. This looks like going ahead and giving your platforms to like political campaigns that is also seen in like most of the majority like developing world, but also more importantly, going ahead and being able to perpetuate all the state propaganda to begin with. Even if say the minority of stakeholders just don't agree with the deal to be strike with the state, the majority still is able to do that, not simply because of the fact that you also get the legitimacy associated with the state now to you, but also because of the fact that the state also gives you help sort of money because of the fact that this information is coming on the broadcast. And note panel, this is incredibly true and incredibly worse, because institutions within developing world are absolutely weak and information asymmetry is incredibly high. And that is why you probably have organizations like Republic Bharat and to a certain extent government-owned organizations like in other countries to begin with, going ahead and launching absolutely distorted narratives about like multiple things that happen within the world. And that is why we think that majority stakeholder is incredibly worse. Before I move on, I'll take CEO.
Yeah, draconian states in the developing world will try to control you anyway. Why are majority stakeholders the tipping point?
Exactly the fact, right? Because at a point in time, you still have like larger amount of individuals. Your ability to go ahead and mitigate the kind of vote is still high. We don't think that everyone existing on that table just necessarily becomes to a certain extent only like, running from one particular narrative, but rather when you are majority stakeholders, it also means that you are to a certain extent connected individuals. This looks like in Fox News when the entire Fox family is running that sort of corporations, and that is why it's worse. Lastly, in terms of how it just goes ahead and disincentivizes independent outlets to come up, having a strong impact on young journalists. We think that young journalists do not have much resources to largely come up with like, to a certain extent, their own media houses and things like that. Simply because of the fact that these media corporations not only have like incredibly high amount of viewership associated with them, but two, also because of the immense amount of resources that they have, they're able to control narrative and the kind of AI to a certain extent they have. We think that the sustainability is far over for these young journalists to come up if to a certain extent they are not agreeing with what the media corporation is doing. And at that point in time, it necessarily goes ahead and asks them to suppress their views. We think the worst thing that they probably end up with citizen journalism, posting things on TikTok, recording things, and ultimately not having much credibility associated with it, because the larger viewership is still controlled by say like these sort of media narratives to begin with. We think we live in a world wherein a lot of young individuals probably to a certain extent are going towards the trend of becoming progressive, or to a certain extent want to see it more. We think that necessarily harms these young journalists to come up with and just becomes incredibly worse within developing world. We think information should be unbiased, and we think that majority stakeholders never essentially go ahead and let them happen.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech. Leader of OP, you have the floor.
Just give me 15 seconds. I'm going to drink some water. Yeah. Am I clearly audible and visible?
All good, fam. Whenever you're ready.
I'll take POIs in chat, preferably from closing. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, we think terrible Republican news channels and amazing Democrat news channels are going to exist on both sides, which are the two extremes, right? We think this debate is about those channels which are in the middle. We think we are better for those channels. We think that's the delta in this debate, right? There's a couple of things that Prime Minister brings up that I want to respond to before I go into over substantive material, right? First, in terms of general idea of how majority stake means there's direct influence over the board and the CEO. I'm going to come to this later as well. But essentially, we think accountability is greater in us. And this is something we're going to weigh off across OO in terms of explaining to you that when you have a specific majority stakeholder there, it's easier to hold them accountable rather than saying that, when there's tons of shareholders, it's going to be easier to hold like the media corporation accountable. We think it's a lot better on our side of the house where you just have one person or like one entity that owns a majority stake in this news corporation or media corporation, and you're going to go ahead and hold them accountable for everything they do, right? And then the second claim that they come up here and say is the idea that, they're going to go ahead and like hegemonize content, etc. And then they talk about how it's going to make information asymmetry worse, right? Panel, we think that we think that's mostly symmetric in terms of how that sort of information asymmetry is going to exist on both sides. Similarly to their entire claim on how it's just there's going to be some AI that's going to come and like going to just put you in an echo chamber. We think that again is symmetric, right? Most of the harms they try to put on us are symmetric on their side as well. We think we need something more from OG in terms of explaining why those harms are exclusive to us. We don't think they are, right? A couple of pieces of framing, right? We think, like I told you, like those both ends, like the extreme ends, like the radical ends of the spectrum are going to exist on both sides. We think this is about the middle, and we think that at the point at which we're talking about news channels in the middle, we think we're better off because we have a clear direction for media at the point at which there's one entity that sort of owns and controls the way in which this media functions. But furthermore, it creates a consistent path for the media corporation to function, right? That being said, we think majority stakeholders are going to allow for a concentrated, clear vision for these media corporations, and it's going to make communication better, which means these become more efficient. That's something I'll come to later. What does government counterfactual look like? It looks like lots of minority shareholders, right? What does that mean? There's a couple of things. That means that now all these minority shareholders have a lot of power because now they all have fringe votes that sort of contribute to the larger scheme of things, right? We think what that means is now fringe votes have greater influence on media direction. We don't think that's necessarily a good thing, right? We think it's better at the point at which you have one clear path on which you want to go ahead with, which is only possible on op, right? But furthermore, we think there's a couple of things, right? One, we think that at the point at which you have a majority stakeholder, you're more likely to go ahead at the point at which you have a majority stakeholder, we think you're more likely to have like a consistent stream of capital, support, and resources, right? Because we think like when you have like one entity that's sort of running everything within this media corporation, we think what's going to happen is you're going to have it's going to allow these media corporations to function a lot more efficiently, and they're going to be able to function a lot better, right? But furthermore, we think it's going to allow for consistent lines of credit. It's going to allow for consistent reinvestment from this majority stakeholder into the media corporation, which is likely to make the media corporation better. What is the comparative on Gov then? On their side of the house, they have like tons of shareholders, but we think that because they don't have enough of a buy-in into this, they're not likely to go ahead and continue reinvesting. At the point at which they think, okay, maybe this investment seems redundant, they're just going to pull out, which is going to hurt the media corporation, right? We think on our side of the house, it's a lot better. It's a lot more stable for the media corporation, both in terms of the path for the media corporation, which is a lot more clear and consistent, but secondly, financially for the media corporation, because now it's like a consistent stream of capital and resources, which allows them to function a lot more efficiently and get a lot more better, right? That being said, so we think those are a couple of the benefits we're getting you on Gov, right? On Op, sorry. A couple of other things then. First, in terms of how media is not just limited to news, like Opening Gov would like to frame it, right? We think media extends to film, music, TV, etc. And we think that at the point at which there's something insanely creative or path breaking, it's less likely to exist on their side because there's going to be a lot of different votes that they're going to have to like opt into the active interest of those shareholders in order to actually have that change occur, right? We think that being said, furthermore, this risk that they're likely to take in order to build something that's insanely creative or path-breaking is a lot the likelihood of them opting into this risk is a lot less, right? That means that they're probably going to have to take like tons of shareholders' interest into consideration, which means that controversial stories, even if you're bringing like only news in, we think controversial stories or something that's pressing, but they simply can't run because there's just too many actors' interest that they need to weigh in. We think that's a lot worse on their side, right? And furthermore, I think what's going to happen is on our side of the house, therefore we have better media and you have more perspectives coming into the mainstream. Before I move on into why accountability is better on our side, I'll take opening.
So let's be clear, like stakeholders are not just like involved in terms of you kind of just like coming up with controversies or not, but they have policies at place, how you go ahead and like portray certain news. And that is why it's comparatively better, because you now do not have like one unilateral narrative coming in.
Okay, so even if you have like a consistent portrayal of news or whatever you'd like to claim that stakeholders do, right? We think it's still going to be better on our side of the house, because on your side of the house, it's going to be a bunch of different actors, different interests weighing in to make that decision. On our side of the house, it's going to be one specific entity's decision or one specific entity's like idea on how to make that thing happen, right? And we think that's a lot better because it's going to be a lot more consistent for the media corporation, right? But furthermore, we tell you in terms of how it's going to be a lot more accountable, right? That's something I'm coming to now. We think it's going to be more accountable because now over here, you can go ahead and hold that one actor, one entity accountable, right? This means that if like one corporation has bought a 51% stake in like India Today news channel, we think at the point at which India Today news channel runs something controversial, you can, or run something that's like inherently bad or whatever, we think you can hold that one entity accountable for going ahead and like doing this through India Today, right? We think that's what we mean by greater accountability. Why is this accountability necessarily better than what you get on Gov side, even if they claim it, right? In terms of their side accountability, they're going to say just because we have like more people voting or like more shareholders that have smaller stakes, it's just going to be a lot more balanced, right? But there's a couple of issues with that. First of all, there's no one who you can actually hold accountable because everyone has some sort of influence, like I explained to you in the beginning, in terms of how on their side of the house, they have like a bunch of fringe votes that like influence the media direction. We think it's going to become a lot harder to actually hold someone accountable. We think on our side of the house, we have better accountability, we have more risk, we have better media and more perspectives. Those reasons and so many more oppose. Sorry.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank DLO for that fine speech. DPM, you have the floor.
All right, just a couple of seconds.
Vladimira, just check message.
Yeah, I'm not seeing the chat, but we'll ask. My stopwatch. Something is happening with my phone. Just a second. Okay. All right. Yeah, I'm not seeing the chat. So, but we'll take POI from closing after 5. If they don't have any, we'll take the opening. All right. Start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Okay, I guess we probably win the top half at the point of which we get no engagement with how media and the engaging with media looks like in the status quo. I'm unclear what is the accountability process and how this looks like on the open opposition at the point of which you're dominating someone's information in the sense of you're the primary information, you're making the sentences that are inside of their heads, you are the news that appears on their feed, given that they follow perhaps Fox News, meaning that they will have, that control over the idea of what you prioritize and what you generally know. I'm not sure why you get competing actors. Note that New York Times or something that is more democratic, like Huffington Post or something like that, is not something that you essentially get when they call out for scandals, etc., on your feed as someone who concerns conservative things. Note also what is the accountability process, because I'm not sure why I have to point finger at the Fox family to make them accountable. At the point of which news outlets fuck up, they probably have decrease in the terms of the value of the stock. This is something that inherently hits every single individual investor that you essentially have. Why is this also important? Know that you are more cautious as an individual investor at the point of which you are making concessions, and when you're making, the decision who will be the CEO, who will be the top editor of the company, etc. Meaning that you are well incentivized to not be a subjective asshole as you will be at the point of which you're the only one making the decisions and having all of that much power over it. I would also posit that at the point at which you have shady things happening, you have more incentive and more ability to actively have whistleblowing happening and all of those kinds of things at the point at which you have other actors that actually do have power over that major actor, which for the reasons that Narayan clearly explained and was never engaged, can engage with the government, can actively do bad things. But I would simply say, even if they're not malicious, note that the idea of you being one person and one person having subjective opinion inherently is something that limits you to the actively investing into the other options and actively accepting some other kinds of the news. And I'm not talking here about news, whether Fox News is gonna now have liberal articles and those kinds of things. Simply on the spectrum itself, the idea of criticizing one or the other part of the spectrum, etc., and having the discussion even on the right-wing spectrum is something that benefits people with the information regarding like how they'll vote, what their priorities should be, what are their concerns should be, etc. This is much more. This is something that is much more likely on our side of the house. Note that this case then is not contingent on you necessarily having a bad actor, although this is something that is a huge harm when it happens, and we're telling you that it actively is happening when you have the example of the Fox News and how it engages with Republican propaganda, etc. on their side of the house. But just like the possibility of having that individual actor is something that inherently limits you in the amount of news that you're likely to engage with. What is then comparative? Even if every single individual obviously has some sort of subjective opinion to some extent, they have to have consensus. They have that kind of like accountability. We will not take the other one being stronger than us, because this will fuck us later at the point of which our stocks is going to be falling down and our profit will not be as big as possible. You're likely to have then to come to something that is a little bit more objective and more accepted. I would say that at that point, even if you have a malicious actor and someone that is extremely conservative, etc., they don't have power to actively make the harm that they do on the opposition side of the house, and that's already a huge win for us. Also note specific part of the content that we bring inside of this debate. And those are young journalists. This is something that is connected, especially to developing countries. I'm not talking here about authoritarian regime actively, censoring you at the point of which you're talking against the government, because this is not a functional democracy. But the idea of you being ex-authoritarian regime, not having the independent media outlets, given that the people with different and more progressive news are often people that are young, not necessarily having the resources, without the viewership and the constant followings, etc., you're not likely to have the development of these kind of media outlets. In these particular countries, major media outlets are the only ones where you can actively have that kind of opinion as being shared in the first place. Note that these people are specifically the ones that engage with progressive opinions or the different critiques that you essentially have. Even if they are to some extent limited to the algorithms, note that these people specifically engage with platforms like TikTok, Facebook, etc. You, at the point of which, like in Iran, you have censorship on how to report on women protesting, etc., and women actively having that citizen journalism moment and shooting the protests and putting those videos on TikTok is something that reaches the young people in particular to report on the certain news. Note that this is the exclusive information that you get only on our side of the house. Given that you have the subjective opinion, this is extremely bad at the point at which you have a malicious actor, but even if you have subjective actor, you're less likely to engage with youngsters because you believe that this is something that is not as certain to be connected to your views as the other people that are currently employed inside of your company. You're less likely to engage with actively hiring new journalists, etc. Before I go on, CEO.
Yeah, young journalists will be booted out on either side of the house if they don't toe the editorial standards of the company. Furthermore, I think citizen journalism is good because it democratizes reporting. So why is your point unique?
Yeah, citizen journalism is actually pretty good, but I think the engagement of the vast majority of people with citizen journalism is something that is limited. Therefore, you need to have the engagement or major media outlets, which you don't get at the point of which you have like old guard of journalists writing the same articles under the same ideology. I think overall, you perhaps might have conservative views, etc. But know that there is a bigger chance of people that are investors actually being the ones that care about the information of the other people's information. These are the ones that are likely to be whistleblowers, etc. At the point of which these are the ones that are gonna, provide that check and balance mechanism in the terms of what news are in the end and what is the general frame that you are willing to operate in. You have much bigger pool of the people and therefore much bigger chance to actively get the actors to the scene that actively care about the information of people, given that perhaps someone who invests as much of a capital inside of the news is likely to be there. Because of all of these things, because of the information of.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank the TPM for that fine speech. Once again, just before you proceed, quick heads up. We do have minors present in the room. Might be best if we do our best to avoid swear words and profanity while engaging in our speeches. Yeah, don't laugh. It's for your benefit. I'm just kidding.
That's fine, my speech.
TLO whenever you're ready.
No, it's about to swear advice. Okay.
It's hilarious because Sid swears the most. So,
All right. Am I clearly audible and visible?
All good. You better not swear either. Just saying. Whenever you're ready.
POs in chat. Let's be clear on the comparative. There is no difference between whether Fox News is owned by Rupert Murdoch or whether Fox News is owned by Rupert Murdoch, Joe Rogan, and I forgot the one who's getting sued, Alex Jones. This is very important because it means that it doesn't matter whether the majority shareholder is bad or whether lots of different groups who are all bad make up the majority stake within the media organization, especially because there's no obligation for media organizations to, for example, invite Democrats to come sit in their board of directors or to have shares within their company. And that's important because it means that the worst excesses, the Fox News of the world and the MSNBCs of the world are going to exist on either side of the house. Why? Because even if they're not being dictated by a single entity, they're still being dictated by individuals with large amounts of consensus in their ideological alignment. So the worst excesses of their actions still happen. What's the impact of this? It means that the vast majority of opening government's impacts are already out of this debate because they're largely focused, no, this is how we can fix Fox News, how we can fix all those problems. No, they remain symmetric. So then what is this debate actually about? It's primarily about all of the media corporations in the middle, those that don't lean on any end of the political extreme, and those are more likely to be owned by a larger number of diverse individuals. We're going to talk about why those exclusively are bad, and I'm going to flip the impacts on this. I want to talk about a couple of things first. They claim that, well, in authoritarian regimes, we're going to be able to bring about mass amounts of change because, we can actually provide support for these individuals. We don't cause censorship to happen. I want to note two things over here. One, media organizations running in authoritarian regimes need a significant amount of support behind them. They need individuals who are constantly willing to go to the bat, who are willing to provide them funding, who are willing to lend them lines of credit at the riskiest moments. This does not happen if you do not have majority shareholders. Why? Because if everyone owns a little stake of your company, nobody feels that much investment or ownership within it, and they feel that if things are going too bad, they can cut their losses rather than investing more. If you have a majority shareholder, there are two things that happen. First, there's a sunk cost fallacy. They already think they've invested so much money in buying these shares, they want the company to do well. But two, they feel a far greater degree of personal ownership over the organization. They feel that there's a lot more money invested in it. There's a greater amount of return they can make. That's important because it means that they're far more willing to go to bat for you. They're willing to give you extra investment. They're willing to bring in capital. They're willing to bring in angel investors. That's critical because not just in authoritarian regimes, but around the world, media organizations which work on the smallest of margins, which work on overextended budgets, are going to be able to get a lot more stability and a lot more income constantly flowing in if they have a single majority shareholder. In absence of that, in propositions comparative, it's far more likely that we see so many more media corporations going bankrupt because individuals are willing to cut their losses and get out with whatever money they can make because they don't feel the same degree of commitment. But second of all, and this is crucial, is the consensus mechanism. They claim that consensus mechanism is going to be good because it moderates the worst influences. But that's not really how it works, is it though? Because the worst influences aren't allowing any moderating influences to buy shares in their corporations anyway. Why? Because they're private corporations and they don't have to. But more importantly, what it means is that in places, in all of these like average media corporations, when, for example, fringe influencers buy shares, when, for example, Fox Corp or other organizations buy shares over here, what they can do is that they can influence the decision-making process. Because now every 5%, every 10%, every 15% shareholder means that much more, because each one of their votes can be enough to flip the entire decision of the board. That's important, because if they can apply that extra amount of influence, this means that they can change the decisions that are being made, or even if not change the decisions, cause compromise or cause bad news to be reported. You can either cause, for example, not negative reporting on Donald Trump's involvement in the January 6th insurrection, or even positive reporting if you're able to sufficiently enough change the perspectives of these individuals, because then your vote holds so much more leverage. This is damning because the consensus mechanism oftentimes means that the most important stories don't get reported on, and in fact, it's a far greater fringe influence. But on important stories, this is particularly crucial. A lot more individuals are now scared. A lot more individuals have different ideological beliefs, so they're unlikely to find similarity, but more than that, they're likely to find a lot more caution when approaching particularly important or path-breaking stories, which is why they're unlikely to generate the consensus that is required for that to actually be published in the first place. It's oftentimes why they're likely to be far more cautious in their decision-making, because now it's not one individual who has the capacity to take risks taking that decision, but it's lots of individuals who have far larger fears who don't want to take that risk. So we end up with far worse stories now outside the house. Important stories don't get reported. On weighing, this is particularly important because it means that even if we get some more bad influences outside the house, we actually get the most important stories out there, and we get media corporations having constant amounts of funding, and we get the best type of news reported. That's important because, as opening government themselves characterize, this is often the first source of information for a lot of people, and they need it for that reason. Before I move on, I'll take CG.
Okay, so if your push is that it's bad that we want to take into account other people, or for example, we want to be able to fixate on a certain subset of people only, isn't that the logical conclusion that you will only take into account the majority and therefore the monopoly happens?
No. The differentiation is that it's not about not taking other people into account. It's the fact that the likelihood of taking other people into account is more likely to be bad. The analysis for this is because who's more likely to be able to afford to buy shares in lots of companies? Rich individuals. Who are they more likely to be? Probably individuals with ties to the political institutions, individuals who own large amounts of company. It's not going to be your everyday activists. It's not going to be your social justice warriors. They don't have the cash. Large billionaires like Trump and Murdoch do. They're the ones who buy shares. They're the ones who influence news to be reported badly. That's a key mechanism. I want to flag two more things. First of all, in terms of expanding this debate, because note that this isn't just about like newspaper and news reporting corporations. This is also about art, and the same mechanisms apply over here, in that a lot of risky art, a lot of art that sends out important political and valuable messaging doesn't get made in the first place because individuals are unlikely to take that risk because they don't come to that consensus. They're unlikely to take that risk also because they know that they're not going to be here to provide funding to this company if it goes down later, and they want to make sure that they can maximize their returns in that time. The next thing I want to flag out is accountability. And this is particularly important because which side of the house is actually able to better pressurize these individuals to create change? This isn't about board decisions. This is about what the public can do. I want to be clear on this. If there's a single entity, there's somebody you can assign blame to. You can point out and say, that's their decision. They did this. They're the reason this bad thing has been reported. That's why you're able to specifically utilize pressure and concentrate it upon this individual. We are able to lobby for specific types of changes when you're able to target and boycott specific types of things that happen. But when it's owned by like 10 different financial hedge funds, then you don't know who to blame because they can pass the blame around on each other. They can obfuscate and cover up who's responsible for which decision, as there's not a single individual you can target. Sure, you can attempt to boycott and pressurize the company writ large, but that doesn't allow you to change individual decision-making in the board the same way you can if there's an individual on the board you are able to specifically target, which means that the capacity to apply pressure is far greater when there's a single target we can focus on. Look, I decided the house is going to have terrible news, but we crucially allow better types of news to exist. They allow the rich to infiltrate and take over it, and they allow consensus mechanisms to take away from the most important stories. For all of those reasons, so proud to oppose.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank the DLO for that fine speech and call upon member of Gov.
Hello, am I audible? Okay, I did a quick outfit change since we're in breaks. I'll take my POIs in the chat. Oops. I'll take my POIs in the chat between the 5th and 6th minute, preferably from closing. Actually opening. Please give the POI when I ask for it. Otherwise, I won't be able to take you. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The problem with the opening debate is that they limit this debate to news media, which is just a small portion of media when there's mostly entertainment and social media, which can have even greater implications on the real world than what they want to talk about. And this is an inherently economic debate because we're talking about stakeholders. But even if you care about this news media debate, the problem is it's almost impossible to win this and it's unstrategic for both teams to focus on it. The reality is everyone is biased. Gov can try to say that certain stakeholders, if there's many of them, will be unbiased. Op can try to say if you have one direction, it'll probably be benevolent. But the reality is when there are profit incentives involved, when there are political incentives on the line, the reality is it's hard to prove who will be benevolent. Everyone is probably greedy. Everyone is profit-oriented. Two things then to ground this debate back in reality. Firstly, media is very broad. Since it's not just news, it has entertainment, social media. And the goal of media is not to be unbiased. So this is basically not knifing OG, but it's showing how unstrategic their case is, right? Media is always biased. Social media algorithms focus on things like social connections, right? And therefore, your friends who probably have similar interests to you, your family who have similar interests to you, means that there will always be echo chambers that favor you because the goal of social media is just to keep you clicking and watching and using the app for advertiser space. And since they want to maintain things like watch time and click time, the reality is the articles will always get clicked on the most are the ones that affirm your own biases, right? But even if this is about news media, like OG says, media outlets, even if it's true that media outlets are the only source of education for majority of people in the developing world, despite how important that might be, it's still impossible to prove that they'll be unbiased. Because regardless of shareholders, right, all news wants to be biased, right? If it's news on TikTok and Facebook, it's broken beyond repair. It's short form. It doesn't really inform people. It uses clickbait sensationalism. It cannot be fixed. But more importantly, discourse is polarized, and therefore news media that tries to be like profitable will always be biased, right? Because opposing political parties call each other out for being biased, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And therefore, just having a simple news team that wants to retain viewership means that when Republicans call the other side biased, there's antagonization. So liberals become antagonistic and there's bias in both ways. And since polarization becomes the norm, it becomes what's trendy, then whatever team of news who wants to get like watches, like even if you're a journalist, even if you're a director of the news, even if you're a news caster, you will try to create narratives about politics that get people angry and make people more polarized, etc., etc. So now that we've taken out or the significance or proven the unlikelihood of OG, let's take out OO, right? Or basically we characterized what the world is really like. Let's take out OO. They say that they want one stakeholder to determine the direction of the company. And we agree that perhaps that will make one unified direction of the company. But this doesn't have value in of its own. We tell you that this one stakeholder is being the majority means that they've amassed enough power and money to become the majority, right? How did they do this? They probably did it because they are extremely rich and they have connections to the rich, or because they know the wants of the majority, right? So it's not likely that you'll get all of the social justice change, unbiased coverage that you want on OO, because the people that these majority stakeholders will cater to will be the richest of the rich, probably favorably portray their own companies and their own billionaire friends, or they will again just capitalize on the polarization narrative that the rest of society wants to consume. Second thing we need to establish about the world, right? Shareholders do not control the majority of media functions, right? Employees do that. This takes out both OG and OO because all employees and any successful company is beholden to the CEO, which gives their general direction to the company that you cannot avoid at the end of the day. This looks like social media engineers and marketing people who understand algorithms better. News media has journalists who write whatever they want, and they have game developers who create whatever games that they want, right? OG, they say that we need shareholders to democratize these companies. But in reality, at most, they can exert pressure over the leaders, the CEOs, and by extension, employees. But the reality is the employees have a lot more control, especially in status quo, right? They can publicize a lot of the stuff, right? If journalists are being told to pay people off, their exact platform means that they can call out the people above them. Workplace practices are more transparent than ever nowadays. And so therefore, that's not where that stuff is mitigated. What does stakeholders or shareholders actually have control in status quo, since these two are synonymous, right? Shareholders are supposed to ensure financial stability, right? They have the principled right to do this because obviously they're creating their they're investing their money in the company, and therefore they need to know that they can get their money back. And therefore the powers that are given to stakeholders is not any of the vague stuff asserted by OG. It's actually mostly financial power, right? The corporate structure is that media and the employees handle the social implications and the content generation. But in terms of financial economic stability of the country, stakeholders need to ensure that this happens. Why? Because they need to make sure that the company stays afloat, right? Even if the news media knows that they are they're getting an audience, right? And the employees are the ones in charge of making sure you have an audience. The stakeholders need to make sure that, firstly, you are not going to get shut down, right? Because of the fact that you don't want the government to actually call you out for being a threat to democracy, etc., etc. They want to make sure that you're not doing anything anti-competitive, and therefore all shareholders, their common interest is that they're profit-oriented, right? OO says that you're just going to have capital flight, people will leave and take their investments elsewhere. No, right? They don't care about being able to create propaganda in news because they just want to be profitable. They invest in companies knowing that no one can have majority control of over media because it will be shut down by the government or called out by whistleblowers that sink the business of the company. So they will still keep their 5% share of media corporations. They won't cut their losses because that's easy passive income in $1 billion media company, right? And so therefore, it's better that in these boardroom discussions, we have a majority of people, and this is where we start building our exclusive contribution, right? You need a majority of people that are ensuring that, one, the government will not shut you down, right? Comparatively, on op, majority stakeholders can take risks. They will be the ones to try to create ultimate control and narratives over the the kinds of news that you create. They will veto the political ads of their political rivals, right? They will do things like antagonize the government and the current government, just like ABS-CBN in the Philippines, and will end up getting shut down because they flew too close with the sun with their political ambitions. But on Gov, they will always resist any radical change to news media. If one stakeholder wants to control the media and move it in one direction that favors one company or one political rival, then obviously the other board of directors will shut this down and make sure they can't do this. Why? Even if these stakeholders are very biased and very self-interested, one, if they are self-interested, then they will probably have stakeholders who are have conflicting interests, right? Like you have two investors who are from opposing telecom companies that's sponsoring one media. So obviously, if it's economically favoring these other news medias, they will shut this down because it's anti-competitive to them, right? If ever there are advertisements that become subliminal advertising and basically comprehensive propaganda campaign to try to get people to buy certain products on government, then obviously because you're all peddling competing products, then each board of director will make sure that this does not actually push through. Sure, on government, we still have one or two ads that go to certain companies, but again, all the other companies are competing for this ad space, and the board of directors make sure that it's not anti-competitive, because if it's anti-competitive, the news will be shut down. This is obviously the most important extension, because if all news is shut down, then no one in the opening debate has any benefits.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank the member of government for that fine speech. Once again, a reminder, POI is a big part of BP engagement. Please do ask and accept him. That notwithstanding, member of OP, you have the floor.
Can everyone hear me and see me? Can everyone hear me and see me?
Oh, I don't think I'm visible to you. Yes, I've been nodding my head vigorously.
Okay, awesome. Great, just give me a second. Great. I am starting in 3, 2, 1, go. Panel, on closing opposition, we have two key extensions. Firstly, we're going to prove to you how media is fundamentally unprofitable as a business to invest in. Therefore, on their side of the house, at the point at which you as a rich person cannot get complete control of a company for whatever purposes you have, you never invest in it. We think that all perspectives are valuable, whether it's by Fox News or CNN. On that side of the house, you don't get any of them. Secondly, we'll explain to you how minority shareholders hold you hostage, don't allow this company to pursue any particular thing. We go beyond opening opposition. This asserting clarity and vision exists. We'll explain how fundamentally they have the ability to hold you hostage and prevent you from going ahead and doing anything. Before that, let's deal with closing government. Firstly, they come up here and say, like you as an employee have complete control over what you do. No one can exert pressure on you. I think this is pretty laughable because if you don't want to get fired, you don't want to go against the management. Secondly, even if you're not at risk of being fired, like even if you're protected, have tenure or whatever, notice you still want to be on the good side of whoever is in the management in order for you to get promoted. Therefore, it's not like these employees have complete control. Secondly, on the idea of shareholders, they come up here and say that when there are many shareholders, they will prevent the company from going against the establishment and getting shut down. I think what this is like code for is simply saying we don't want to do anything anti-establishment, like we just want to be pro-government. I don't know why that is good reporting. But secondly, even if you buy that, like if I'm a rich majority shareholder, like I want to protect my profits, why will I go against the government? This argument is completely non-unique in that sense of the manner, but I will clash with it further. Okay, firstly, why is it that media is fundamentally unprofitable? 4 key reasons. Number one, people currently do not want to subscribe. At the point which you get money, you can get your news from Facebook or Twitter. At the point which you have small attention spans and can't sit through an entire newspaper. At the point which you don't want to commit to that $80 subscription for an entire year, you don't know you'll read that entire thing. Subscriptions are steadily falling to all these newspapers. Secondly, notice ads give you very little money per click. That is to say that like they give you like per 10,000 clicks or something, a couple of dollars. But on the other side, if you go ahead and do sensationalism to get a lot of clicks, you lose credibility and people don't follow you from the next time. Further, there are ad blockers available. So both on the ground, like paper news as well as on online news, it becomes unprofitable in that sense. Thirdly, notice it takes large fixed costs to buy studios, to pay journalists, to buy airtime. Fourthly, often when you're revealing the truth, you often face legal liability in terms of things like slap suits from people who don't like what you're reporting. Therefore, it takes a lot of money in that sense too. Why then will people only invest despite this unprofitability if they have complete control? I think when you want to like have a say in the news, right? Like Elon Musk wants to have a say on what's happening. Like Jeff Bezos buys the Washington Post in order to be able to have some say on what's going on in the world. We think you want to have control over what is being put out. Or when you're a minority shareholder, you do not fundamentally have that. There are 3 fundamental impacts of this. Number one, this media doesn't exist, i.e. it is not set up on their side, and these perspectives are never heard. We still value the perspectives Fox News and CNN have. On their side of the house, when you have a bunch of minority shareholders, no one is willing to burn the cash to keep it afloat. Secondly, what they do is that they actually take it private, right? So they never put up an IPO because they know they're like in this world there is no majority shareholding. That is even worse because they have zero accountability. There is no disclosure requirements whatsoever. There is no external scrutiny coming in on you. Thus, they have complete carte blanche to do anything they want. Thirdly, I think small and local media, which exists in like small towns, villages, which covers those areas, is the lifeblood of news reporting. It fundamentally needs funding to survive because like you have a very small subscriber base. We think at least like companies like Fox News buy them up, consolidate them, keep them going. On that side of the house, that does not happen. Okay. Second argument, why minority shareholders will hold you hostage. We agree with CEO that you have CEOs on either side of the house, right? These CEOs are supposed to have some sort of vision you have voted in. Therefore, I don't know why OO's point about clarity, which is just like a literal sentence anyway, makes any sense. We're going to firstly come and characterize who are minority shareholders. There are 2 kinds of people. Number one, people who lack enough money to buy a majority stake, right? If you have enough money, you can always convince people to sell at a high enough price, maybe like small investors. Or secondly, people who don't believe in the company enough to buy a massive stake to become a majority shareholder. Why is this why will they hold the company hostage? Number one, they're legally protected. So the state often doesn't want bullying of minority shareholders by the majority stakeholder. It's politically popular to protect them. Therefore, they're legally insulated and they can take decisions that don't benefit the company. They can hold and stop decisions that the board is trying to make, and the laws will protect them. So when Ratan Tata fired Cyrus Mistry for not doing what he wanted, Cyrus Mistry, despite being a minority shareholder, could literally hold up the entire company. We think therefore, like they're outsized amount of power. Secondly, notice they get to attend every single meeting. They get to have minutes and so on. If they don't like the direction of the company, instead of going in the board, like talking it out, they just leak that information, right? We think this hurts the public image of the company insofar as you can't ensure confidentiality. Thirdly, notice small shareholders want immediate profits. So they want dividends right away. They don't want to reinvest the money back into development. So you can't expand and the company. Furthermore, I think they have an incentive to sell before every other minority shareholder. That is to say, if one minority shareholder starts selling first, the market thinks there's something wrong with the company, and everything, all the price drops, right? Therefore, it's a race to the bottom of who will sell first. We think, therefore, you have no guarantee on when they're staying for the company, when they're leaving the company. You're not able to expand, whereas majority shareholders stay for the long term. Fourthly, they often vote out good managements simply because they aren't represented, right? They oppose the management for the sake of opposing simply because they aren't represented. They often have vetoes in this sense. Fifthly, notice they often allow hostile takeovers for a high enough sum. What this means is the editors, the journalists, all the employees who work for you, they do not know whether this current board will be sticking around for any point or not. They don't know when the stock price might crash. They don't know when something might be leaked to the media. They don't know when their CEO might be deposed. Fundamentally, therefore, there is uncertainty whether to join it or not. What this leads to is constant deadlock in the boardroom. Insofar as you aren't able to agree on what you want to pump out, insofar as the decisions you make are fundamentally undermined every single time because one shareholder isn't happy with it, at the point which you can't expand in the long term simply because you can pull out at any point whenever the price is high enough for them. You fundamentally don't have certainty as a business to expand. Therefore, at the end of this debate, at CEO, we firstly prove to you why these companies will not exist unless you are a majority shareholding. Even if they do exist, on their side of the house, they'll be constantly deadlocked. They'll not be able to get any work done. We at least have functional media outlets on our side of the house. I'm so proud to oppose.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank the member of OP for that fine speech. I'll now like to call upon GovWhip. Here. Once again, a reminder before that and GovWhip that POIs, ask and accept him. It's a good thing.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I would love to get POIs in chat. I'll try to take you. I have a preference for opening opposition, but if they don't speak, then just CEO, go ahead. Okay, sure. 3, 2, 1, let's go. Very simple structure. OO, then CO, then OG. Let's go straight to it. Why do we beat opening opposition? The first push them is that you will have to strive to pander. If the push we want to take into opening opposition's best case only takes into account the majority. Second,
GovWhip, Bear, I don't know if you can hear us.
This opening opposition, our argument and mention.
Member of Gov might be best if you can get in touch with Bear because I don't think they can hear us.
Okay.
Yep.
Hello.
Hey, Bear, we can hear you now, but your voice got extremely choppy to the point we really couldn't understand what you were saying right from the get-go. Ping that out in the chat as well. So, do you reckon maybe switching off the camera, alternative devices, anything that could work? I know Philippines is in a bad shape now, but anything available?
Yeah, I think we've lost them for a second.
Cool. Maybe try getting in touch with them and letting us know. We'll wait for a couple of moments.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you.
Peace.
So, hi. Is this better?
Slightly, but given the fact that you were good for the mic check and choppy, do you mind giving us just like a couple of sentences as a mic check before you start again?
Okay, I will just read what's in front of me. Welcome to Admu AC. This is a brand new shiny server. Here are some steps to help you get started. For more, check out our Getting Started guide.
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Okay.
The plug notwithstanding.
Okay. All right.
Whenever you're ready.
Yeah. Okay, solid. Okay. Okay, again, so POIs in chat. 3, 2, 1, let's go. Very simple structure. Opening opposition, CO, OG. Let's discuss why we beat opening opposition. The first push from them is that we will have to pander towards many different individuals and many different stakeholders. First, this is a concession to our argument on monopoly. If the push from them is that we take into account too many, the logical conclusion on opening opposition's best case is that they only take into account the majority. Second, given this, Voting opposition needs to A, mitigate our extension on monopolies, but B, argue why having quick, simplistic stakeholder meetings are significantly more important than preventing monopolies from taking over media companies. Third, the response from Deputy Leader of Opposition was that, well, all shareholders are rich, but that's precisely the point. If there were regulations to prevent these rich individuals from taking majority of the company, then they're less likely to become pervasive and less likely to fall into a lot of the harms that were suggested by Riv in the member's speech. The next push from them is on accountability. They suggest that if we have a majority, it's easier to hold them accountable. It's very difficult to hold accountable both the majority and the minority or people in general. We have a couple of responses. First, opening opposition does not explain why only the majority is at fault. We argue that in a media outlet that that advocates for monopolies, that peddles misinformation, everyone, even if you are in the minority, are liable. Second, it's not just principally, it's also pragmatically, because these are people who individually contribute to the operations of these media outlets. Things like they speak up in stakeholder meetings, they lobby amongst other stakeholders. Their money often goes into the hands of the people who continue to peddle fake news or, for example, fail to innovate themselves. Third, meaning all of them deserve to be held accountable. And we would prefer a world wherein we go after every single one of them. And if it means, for example, advocating for the world that government prefers, which is that we all have an equal amount of share in the company, and that's what makes it easier to go after them, then so be it. In comparison to the world where on their end, you will allow to only go after the majority, but the other people in the minority, even if they are liable for the faulty operations, still go scot-free. We ratio OO because Riv explains why cronyism within media companies will continue to persist. But second, we also prove that this anti-competitive behavior puts outlets at risk of shutdowns, and when shutdowns happen, none of the benefits of opening opposition will accrue. The next thing we argue is, why do we beat closing opposition? The first push from them is that media outlets are unprofitable. Therefore, if we don't allow people to occupy the majority, then no one is going to put money into media outlets. At present, this is untrue. First, there are multiple revenue streams in media. Things like they were oligopolies initially. Now, for example, there are a lot of revenue streams like subscription models, like premium versions, like putting ads, for example, etc. Second, there's a lot of demand currently. Third, there's also a lot of opportunity to diversify. So, for example, in films, you can have multiple projects at once. Under, for example, news outlets, there are different branches of news outlets and media outlets that you can make. So, for example, under Condé Nast, we have things like Bon Appetit and other magazines that equally make money at the same time. The next thing they give you is that the alternative is Facebook. We would suggest that Facebook is not enough for a lot of people. A lot of people want information, but also want that information to be consolidated in one media space, free from distractions like cat videos, so what your mom's posting on Facebook. But third, in the context of this debate, in which we agree that what we want to go against are corporate dynasties, a lot of individuals would still become shareholders, even if they're not promised to be part of the majority because of things like legacy, family duty, and obligation. So this means that on their end, the harm of losing out on shareholders is not true. We win on that clash. The next thing they push is that stakeholders will behave badly by being bad people. First, this is asserted. Second, if we do, then they break their shareholder responsibilities and therefore we can kick them out. Third, closing opposition downplays minority shareholders by saying that they only want petty things. We suggest no, because often these advocates rating their salary, like their principles, how they think the creative or journalistic execution of a company should be done, how should affect people, for example. But fourth, we would suggest that it's worse on their end because insofar as they can't make significant impact because they can't beat out the majority, they can't beat out the monopoly of the people in the majority, they have nothing to do but be a nuisance, and that's where they're more likely to not be responsible shareholders. The next thing we're going to discuss is opening government, but before I proceed, PY from OO.
On our side, we get accountability, and we show to you how exactly we're going to have more risks being taken. On your side, all you have is lockups because minority shareholders all have different interests. How do you achieve anything on your side? Because news outlets simply stop functioning because no one has the same interests.
So I think the issue on your end is a lot of your accountability mechanisms are a little too reactionary. So it only happens, for example, when there are a lot of scandals being made. It only happens, for example, when a lot of monopolies are being done or when a lot of misinformation is being peddled. On our end, the very structure of shareholder meetings occurs such that we make it more democratic, such that people can check and balance each other, such that the interests of people within the majority aren't those being advocated for. I don't care if you're saying here. These are impacts that came from closing government. Next, why do we beat opening government? The first win condition on opening government is that majority stakeholders have a monopoly. We have a couple of criticisms towards the way they argue is things that, for example, impacts assume liberalism of all people in the shareholder meeting. How do we improve this argument on closing government? We explain why meeting is essential, independent of their political beliefs. Things like trends change, for example, with regards to diversity and regional news. Second, it's the notion of marketplace of ideas and being able to check and balance, have discourse, for example, other things like that. Third, we decrease the likelihood of creative and journalistic strategy being unchecked, being stagnant, and being redundant, which are essential in order to allow a lot of these media outlets to become very innovative and keep up with the times over time. The second win condition they give is that often they have a lot of subjective opinions. But before I proceed, last chance, whoever didn't see why the last time, CO. Okay, cool. So the next
your rebuttal to our extensions were literally saying subscriptions and like other revenue streams exist. We explained why these subscriptions are falling, why people aren't subscribing, why ads give you so little money. Can you deal with our actual mechanisms?
So again, you don't have to respond to just one of the structural reasons. We gave you 3. You have to respond to all of them in order to fully prove that these things aren't profitable for the shareholders. We also give you things like legacy and duty. Anyway, so last win condition, subjective opinions. Couple of criticisms. Minority doesn't automatically mean young and liberal. This is not always true. Young people can also be conservative. We would suggest that there are different interests. So, for example, marketing strategy, HR policy expanding towards international communities. And additionally, also, this broadly more impactful because this affects strategy, competition with competitors, determines innovation. We also mitigate bad Apple behavior, but also things like company websites, digital marketing, and transformation. These are all things that some people in the majority may be averse to, but we're not sure. But the point is, insofar as everyone has an equal share, the ability to put forth different strategies and ideate common ground and make concessions becomes more likely. We beat opening government because, first of all, opening government relies on the minority being progressive. And insofar as right news outlets will have conservative people still in the minority, but also leftist outlets will not have this issue because people in the majority are progressive to begin with. Their argument or their frame on progressivism is unimportant, but we also engage in opposition more robustly by tackling the core of their logic. For all these reasons and more, your ballot must go to.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank GovWhip for that fine speech. OpWhip, whenever you're ready.
Just give me like 1 second. I'm turning on my timer.
To WhatsApp.
Oh yeah, I've checked it. Great. Right. Beginning in 3, 2, 1. Right. In my speech, I'll be targeting 3 main areas. Firstly, addressing and rebutting the arguments of opening government. Secondly, rebutting the arguments of closing government. And finally, showing to you why the extensions provided by closing opposition win. Now, firstly, coming to the arguments of opening government. The first major point they bring out is a point about censorship, how majority stakeholders could lead to excess censorships. We counter it by saying that we could adopt a UK sort of model to regulate media and the contents and what is banned and what is not banned. This could be through content regulation policies, which are fair and free and fair, framed through government regulators through extensive consultations. Now, will censorship occur? Yes, it will, but there is nothing on the side of opening government or closing government to justify that no censorship will occur on the side of government. Now, moving on, there is we frame simply in our arguments that all media is biased, and to think and taking on from that, we mean to say that just using a point brought up by opening government is that media is used for election campaigns. And now we again say that we can counter this once again to prevent abuse of bias. While we will allow for bias, we want to prevent the abuse of bias. So we could have stronger election campaigning rules and work in the status quo itself to prevent majority stakeholders from abusing their position. In encapsulating our arguments, we're trying to say that we are okay with majority stakeholders, but are against the abuse of power by said majority stakeholders. Before I move on, I'll take a POI from closing government.
So again, I think you need to compare a little bit between the idea of you having too many majority people and how we're able to pervade.
I'm so sorry, you cut out for me in the second. Can you just repeat your question, if that's fine?
Okay, so given that you're advocating for a majority, what do you think are structural reasons in which minority stakeholders will be able to pervade or compete or have their opinions go against the majority people?
Right. So our model does not say that a company has to be 100% owned by majority stakeholders. We allow for the existence, of minority stakeholders, who would be entitled protections as they are currently under law of various countries, which insulates their position and protects their position as minority shareholders. And those laws are quite favorable to minority shareholders, and that's why we believe they'll be able to prevail. Now, moving on to my next point, a point that was also brought up in a POI by my member of opposition. We believe that a majority stakeholder news outlet and media company would be more able to counteract a draconian government trying to shut it down, simply because it has economic and other resources available to it that a minority shareholder, an exclusively minority shareholder owned media outlet would not. Now, a point about young journalists that was repeated by opening government is that they would be prevented from speaking. Now, we have pointed this out in our POIs and replies in our speeches that every place has editorial standards. If you do not meet such editorial standards, you will be fired from that place. Now, moving on to the arguments raised by the Deputy Prime Minister, she brings out an accountability method on stock price, that as the stock price goes up or down, there would be an accountability method. We find this to be a very flawed accountability method, considering the fact that it is only major news corporations which are have IPOs out and are publicly traded where this accountability method could even exist. And even in these scenarios, a share price is not in the very short run is not a determination for accountability, as it is of little consequence unless it's a very sharp fall or a very sharp decline, which does not come in day-to-day running. Now, a point about small media outlets. We brought this up in our speeches also. Independent media in small cities can only exist when majority stakeholders exist, simply because of the funding they provide and the resources they provide, which will not be possible in the case of minority shareholder media. Now, coming to the arguments made by the member of government, he says that firstly, this is just an economic debate, then proceeds to counteract himself when he acknowledges the fact that there does exist a political motive. Now, secondly, his argument about employee control is once again too far-fetched. Taking the example, we can't assume, taking his example on face value, that maybe a Bernie bro can walk into Fox News and start turning it into MSNBC day by day. That is absolutely false. Now, coming to the next point, he says that, well, a minority shareholder will not want to cut his losses and enjoy passive income. I put it to you that what if the news channel is making millions of losses, like most news channels do, simply because they are unprofitable structurally, which I will bring out when I talk about why our extensions win. So when the news channel is making a loss, will shareholders stick around? And the second question put out is that, are the shareholders in this news channel to exert control over the media, like side government has proposed, that minorities shareholders will each exercise individual control? Or are they just here for passive income? That is a bit unclear from their side. Now, a flaw in the side government's closing government's argument is the fact that they believe that there'll be a diverse group of minority shareholders, which will all contribute to keep the media in check. But in reality, it will be people with the same or similar ideologies who are combining with each other to form news channels. So maybe 1,000 Republicans get together to start a new Fox News. Now, that will not have the same benefits of neutrality like side government proposes, whereas the fact it will only have their drawbacks of drowning out right-wing voices, etc. Now, I'll come to my extensions now. And in our extensions, we primarily show three things. We show why news media is unprofitable and capital intensive, and how minority shareholders cause conflict while going up the company. So our first extension was that media is structurally unprofitable, which is why we see so many media companies going bankrupt, subscriptions are falling, ads give you very little revenue, there are massive fixed costs and legal liabilities. This counteracts the point of opposition government whip, where she says that, well, you can use revenue streams. Well, even if these revenue streams exist, they can't be monetized to their fullest extent to sustain news media. So therefore, the only way to get rich people or investment banks or even political action groups to burn money on this is to give them complete control. On their side, these perspectives never exist or go private, which is even worse on the side of side government. Now, small media outlets also do not exist on their side of the house because they aren't propped up, because there is not enough funding from minority shareholders. And secondly, our second extension was that stakeholders have incentives not aligned with the best interests of the company. They want money as soon as possible. They do not care about long term and are only interested in the short term. If they don't like what the company is doing, they can leak the information, dump the stocks, they can legally hold up the management or vote out the management. If it goes against them, this means that these companies are fundamentally deadlocked, can't pursue anything. And it's for these reasons that the opposition side OO is defeated by government, is defeated by side OO. Now, I just want to, in my last submissions, address a few points that the government whip brought out. But sadly, I'm out of time. So proud to oppose. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank OpWhip for that fine speech. Additionally, thank you so much, everyone, for this lovely debate. Rather entertaining. We'll have our results back at the announcements and later, but for now, please do give us the room after you cross the floor. Peace. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Harsh, bro, you're still here as well. Do you reckon you can give us the room?
I'm sorry. Yeah. I'm just
Peace. All good. Cool. Omar, Youngwoo, you all know the drill. So we'll just take a couple of minutes, iron out our tentatives, and then we'll get started.